Hello folks, I make it 2 o'clock on the second Wednesday of the month, so that makes it Webinar Wednesday. Welcome along, thank you for joining us. We've got myself, Summer Mesa, and we're joined once again by Liz Mayhew.
Afternoon everyone.
And this afternoon we're going to take you through employment references. We're looking to share with you some top tips when requesting, reviewing and issuing references, so that's what we're going to be covering over the next half hour, 45 minutes or so. Those of you who have joined us before, you'll be familiar with your friendly webinar toolbar there. If we've got any new friends who have joined us this afternoon, that toolbar that you can see on screen, if you look just down towards the bottom there, you can see a chat feature. Click on that box and much like a text message, you can tap away and share your thoughts and questions with us. Certainly we hope to be able to deal with any questions that you might have during the course of this afternoon's session. If, in terms of time, we're not able to do that, we're able to keep a record of the questions that you submit, and we'll look to share a follow-up article with those of you that have attended and answer your questions in any case. So please do share your thoughts and questions. So let's look to get started, and Liz, share with people what we're covering this afternoon.
Yeah, so as always, a fairly packed agenda for the next 45 minutes. We're going to start the session by looking at the importance of references and their place in the recruitment process. And then we'll move on to cover the basics, the who, what, the where and the how. So basic overview of what you should be doing and what best practice is around references. Then we're going to spend a little while looking at the legalities of references before moving on to look at some particular circumstances relating to health and absence, safeguarding, where someone's got a formal warning on their record, and how you might deal with references in those circumstances. Moving on, we're going to look at how you might deal with any concerns that come about when you're receiving references and what that means for making offers. And finally, we're going to look at what information you can disclose to candidates about the information contained within a reference, as that's something that quite often comes up for us in terms of queries. And finally, we'll leave you with some top tips to take away.
We do love our top tips. Let's start with the importance of references then, and just revisit the importance of references. And certainly references are a tool for supporting, not making recruitment decisions, and I think that's something really key to keep in mind in terms of the value of references. It's about supporting you making those recruitment decisions. In terms of the making of recruitment decisions, that's where your interview and your selection activities come in. So it's those activities that inform who is your preferred candidate off the back of those activities, that interview selection process, and then your references are there to help support in making those decisions. It's also about assessing the candidate's ability to carry out the duties of the post, and that's informed by their previous experience and previous employment, I should say, and the views of their previous employer. It's about verifying information provided by the candidate, and as you can see there, it's one of a number of pre-employment checks and conditions to the job offer. And we talk about this in a little bit more detail later, but certainly any job offer should be conditional upon satisfactory pre-employment checks, and of course the reference is but one of those. And it's very much about, think of it as sort of a puzzle. It's about bringing all the pieces of information together to give you a really rich picture of the candidate, as it says there, our first bullet point, to help support your recruitment decision and your decision making. As Liz mentioned, we're going to look at the basics and just revisit those as well, and we're going to look at the when you request references, who you should be requesting those from, and how you go about doing that, and what it is that you're looking to cover. So let's pick up on each of those in turn. So the when. You should, and this is in terms of guidance from Keeping Children Safe in Education, so a bit of a nod to safer recruitment at this point, you should be requesting references prior to interview, and that's about giving you the opportunity to be able to look at those references, assess those references, Are there any anomalies in terms of the information that an applicant has provided on their application form as part of their personal statement? And if there are any anomalies, you'll want to take the opportunity to explore those at interview, and that gives you the opportunity to do that. And yes, absolutely. So who are you going to be gaining references from? Well, it should be from the current or most recent employer, and they should be sought from the head teacher or the business or setting manager. So if this were somebody looking to move into education from, say, a care environment, you would be wanting to go through to the registered manager for that setting rather than taking a reference from a team leader or another colleague. So you're wanting to go through to the manager. Those of you who have more senior roles within your schools will appreciate, certainly in terms of data protection, colleagues may not be aware of concerns or issues relating to a member of staff, and that's why you should be going to the head teacher or the setting manager, the business owner, because as head honcho, for want of a better word, they're afforded all the necessary information of their individual employees. So that's why you would be looking to approach those individuals.
And certainly in a school setting, you would absolutely expect, where someone's worked in a school previously, for the reference from that school to be provided from the head teacher.
Yeah.
And it would certainly ring alarm bells if another manager was given to provide that reference.
Yeah.
Sorry for jumping in there somewhere.
Also, if they have worked in the children's workforce previously, you should always be going back to their last children's workforce employer. So if I, as a candidate, apply to your school, my most recent employer was a retailer, a popular known supermarket, for want of a better example, but say 5 years ago I had previous experience within a childcare setting, or perhaps even a school. You should be looking to go back to that previous children's workforce employer, so approaching that childcare setting, again the setting manager, or approaching that previous school, the head teacher, and requesting a reference on that basis. Okay, and that's part of, again, the expectations in terms of keeping children safe and safer recruitment and safeguarding your children and young people. Personal and character references, these should be accepted with caution. Ideally, you're going to want to gain a reference from a professional reference, I should say, an employment reference from their previous employer, and there may be individuals, perhaps students, who might want to work within your schools or undertake their first paid position within your schools, who may not have had previous work experience, in which case you might be looking at character references perhaps from tutors or from careers advisors within their secondary education. But ideally, and particularly where somebody has got previous employment experience, you would be wanting to approach their employers. In terms of any issues with gaining references, or certainly in terms of the referees that have been mentioned on an application form, you're not happy with those, don't look to undertake secret inquiries. If you have concerns about the referees mentioned on an application form, talk that through with the candidate, make contact with them, advise them that the people that they've made reference to aren't verifiable sort of sources in terms of your process, and can they identify a more appropriate referee for you to approach. Don't look to undertake secret squirrel inquiries. You want to be open, honest and transparent. If they don't provide you with suitable alternatives, then you may well decide that actually that means that they aren't able to provide you with satisfactory pre-employment checks, and potentially you may well remove an offer of employment on that basis. If you've got any queries or concerns about that, and certainly in terms of what we talk about throughout this webinar, then of course you can make contact with us and we can look to provide you with advice on a case-by-case basis. Okay. other things that we want to look at. So the how, let's just move back there, how of undertaking reference checks, apologies. So you're going to want to obtain references in writing. You're going to make your application in writing, approaching, as I say, the head teacher and or setting manager, employer, business owner, and do that in writing. Ideally, you would have standard pro formas for gaining references, and that enables you to demonstrate consistency and also means that the referees are providing the information that you request, that you need for your purposes to fulfil your requirements for a suitable and satisfactory pre-employment check reference in this case, and you can gain that information. Beware of verbal or open references, and we get quite a lot of questions about this, Liz, don't we? And it's a really difficult area. Certainly in terms of open references, those sort of to whom it may concern references, in terms of keeping children safe in education, and again safeguarding, and we will continue to make reference to these guidelines, as you'll appreciate through this afternoon's webinar. Open references should not be accepted at all. You want to be able to gain information from a verifiable source, i.e. you know who that reference is, who you're receiving that information from, and it can be sort of tested and assessed effectively, as it were. I don't know if this will shock people, but certainly in terms of Ian Huntley and the Soham murders, the awful case of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, Ian Huntley had open references when he applied to work at the neighbouring secondary school in that case, and certainly off the back of that and the various inquiries and investigations that were undertaken as a result of that awful case, one of the recommendations was not to accept open references, and as I say, having that verifiable source to go back to. Verbal references are problematic for other reasons, in that it is difficult to unknow what you have been told, first and foremost, and if the information means that you would look to question the applicant's suitability, it is difficult for you then to evidence your decision making. So if you ultimately look to go to withdraw an offer of employment and it's off the basis of verbal information, that leaves you in a very difficult position to be able to evidence sound, fair, a consistent approach to your recruitment of staff. If colleagues look to provide you with a verbal reference, I think it's important that you make it known that you are taking notes and
possibly even ask the person who's given that information verbally to confirm that in writing, because what you really want to be able to have is documentary evidence of the factual information that's been shared with you, as opposed to an informal chat on the phone. But as someone was saying, we would really discourage the use of verbal references because of how problematic they are.
They are, absolutely. Use email with caution and always make sure that it's a business email address. And again, when we mentioned about who you should be approaching for references, certainly if it's a head teacher, business manager, setting manager, you would be wanting to make use of business email addresses, further underlining the fact that this is a professional employment reference. If people are providing you with personal email addresses for supposedly professional references, then certainly that would be something to question as well. It should be going through those business channels, a formal email address.
Just to add there before we move on, folks might be interested in knowing that on our website we have some template reference pro formas. So if you're not currently using a standard form style pro forma to capture information from references, you might want to check those out, and they're in the recruitment section of the website.
Lovely, thanks Liz. In terms of what you're going to want to ask about and cover on your reference, and of course those templates that Liz mentioned, we helpfully cover this for you. Going to want to confirm obviously dates of employment and make sure that that tallies with the information that's been provided within the application form. You'd be wanting to check job title, duties, responsibilities and performance, formal warnings, whether there's any substantiated safeguarding allegations. You'd be wanting to ask about their suitability to work with children, and actually that's a question that is pertinent, of course, if they have experience in the children's workforce, so previous experience in a school or childcare setting, but it's still a question that you should ask of any employer. So actually I may well have worked in a completely different sector, perhaps retail, to continue with that example, having referenced it earlier, because there might be information that those employers can offer about the individual's manner, approach, behaviour, that whilst they haven't worked directly with children, could call into question nonetheless their suitability to work with what is a vulnerable group. And of course you'd want to ask questions about reasons for termination. And just going back, the when that you ask for this information and relating it back to safeguarding and keeping children safe in education, the reason that you would be looking to gain this information prior to interview, as I say, is about being able to review, assess the information that you're given. Are there any anomalies with the application form in terms of dates of employment, in terms of the duties and responsibilities that have been referred to and sold to you in inverted commas in terms of the personal statement? Does that tally with the roles and responsibilities that the referee refers to, and the other information there? So if there are any anomalies, again, you have the opportunity to explore those at interview, helping you to make that all the more informed decision. Okay, so that's the what that we've covered. We're now going to look at health and absence, because obviously that's another important element of references. The legal bit.
Yes. You've missed out the legal bit. Yes, just want to touch on the legal element in terms of references, but obviously don't want to overplay this and cause concern, but there are some legal parameters around the asking of references. As you might know, there's no legal obligation on any employer to provide a reference, so it's perfectly possible that you might request a reference and the current employer will say no. However, in schools and academies and in education settings, it is the accepted practice that employers will provide a reference. So if you've got an applicant, a candidate, who's currently working or has worked in a school setting, and that employer comes back and says, no, I'm not in a position to provide a reference for that individual, that should certainly be ringing alarm bells with you, because you would be expecting, as it is the practice, for a reference to be provided in those circumstances. Other employers, it may just be their policy to provide no reference, or a very brief summary factual reference just confirming dates of employment, and that's absolutely fine, and that is legally permissible. However, when you're making a school appointment, you may want to probe a little bit more deeply to establish really whether that is the organisation's policy, or whether there's something about that particular candidate which means that the organisation is unwilling or reluctant to share any further information. So it's just about looking at who is providing the reference and what you could reasonably expect them to provide. And certainly if you're not getting a full reference from another school, that should be setting some alarm bells ringing there.
Yeah, and the other thing, just to add on to that, if you are having difficulties receiving a reference from a previous school, I think it's important to highlight to them keeping children safe in education and the collective responsibility that you have as schools, as part of the children's workforce, to support each other in making, safe recruitment decisions. And so don't be afraid to make reference to those obligations and requirements that you all need to follow, and the fact that you should be supporting each other in that aim. Can we move on to health and absence?
Oh, do you want me just to cover the last couple of bits on the slide? You're so keen, Summer. Just to add that when providing a reference, you as the author of a reference have a duty to ensure that the information you provide is accurate, fair, and not misleading in any way. That information should be factually based and not opinion based. And that's because you have a duty to the subject of the reference to ensure that you're sharing information fairly and objectively, and that you can justify factually any statement you're giving, but particularly any negative statements. So if you're making a comment about a certain aspects of someone's performance when you're providing a reference, you'd need to be able to justify or evidence why that is the case. So just have in mind that duty to be factual, accurate, and not misleading. And now, Summer, we can talk about health and absence.
This is my favourite bit. Okay, let's have a look.
Okay, so under the Equality Act, employers have a legal obligation to ensure that when they're seeking references, no question is asked about disability, and by implication also about health and absence prior to a job offer being made. So in a school setting where through safer recruitment considerations you are likely to be requesting references prior to interview, so prior to the point of job offer, at that point it wouldn't be appropriate for information to be sought about disability, health and absence. However, once you have made an offer to an applicant, then it is perfectly possible and allowable for you to go back to the referee and say, we've made the offer, now I'd like to establish some factual information about absence, attendance, health matters. If you're going to adopt that two-stage reference process, so part of the reference before the offer and then supplementary questions around health after the offer has been made, you need to make sure that all your candidates were aware that that's how the school worked and that there would be this two-stage reference process. But that will enable you to gather and make an assessment about health and disability issues post the offer being made. Okie doke. Shall we move on to look at safeguarding now?
Let's move on, yeah. Okay, so safeguarding then. We've started to touch on this because actually references, recruitment, it's all about wanting to make safer recruitment decisions. So just to sort of reiterate, you're asking whether the referee is completely satisfied of the applicant's suitability to work with children. You can only ask about substantiated safeguarding allegations, not unsubstantiated, unfounded or indeed malicious, and what you should be referring to if you are providing the reference is the outcome form, and these forms certainly should be retained by schools, by employers, so that if there is a change of personnel, a new administration, i.e. a new head teacher, they're in a position to comment appropriately in a reference and provide you with the information that you will need if there's anything to report on this basis. And just to say, actually, in terms of safeguarding, please do keep up to date with keeping children safe in education. Certainly we offer safer recruitment training, and any one member of a recruitment panel needs to have safer recruitment training up to date in order to fulfil the requirements of keeping children safe in education. And it is a document, it is a series of guidance that is updated regularly. Certainly within the last 18 months to 2 years, I think it's been updated as many as 3 times. And prior to the election, I was hearing noises that actually keeping children safe in education may well become an annual update, much like the Teachers' Pay Terms and Conditions document, that it will be reviewed annually, such as the pace of change in this area of work. Certainly, e-safety, etc., moves at such a pace, and wanting to take account of that in the guidelines around keeping children safe in education. So please do keep up to date with what's happening in that area of work, and certainly we'll be providing articles as things change and be updating our training likewise, but just keep yourselves up to date. Let's have a look at another important issue. So we've covered health and absence, we've had a very quick look at safeguarding. Let's have a look at formal warnings and current issues.
Yeah, this is an area where we quite often get queries from schools about what they can ask in terms of warnings and what they're obliged to disclose. The basic rule of thumb is that you are able, when providing a reference or seeking a reference, to ask questions about live formal warnings only. So live sanctions that may have been issued to the employee through a disciplinary process, an absence process, a capability process, which are live. So you may be aware that formal sanctions have an expiry period. While they are live, they can be shared in a reference. After that expiry point, it wouldn't be appropriate for you to be sharing that information or asking for that information in a reference. If an individual has been subject to what we might call management action or informal action, essentially a bit of a ticking off for doing something inappropriate, you wouldn't be expected to share that in a reference. It's only those formal level issues and warnings you'd be expected to share. In terms of capability information and information about processes that an individual may have been in to manage their performance, under the school staffing regulations, which apply to maintained schools only, where an individual is looking to move to a new teaching post, and that's in a maintained school, the receiving employer is able to ask about any formal capability procedures that individual has been in the preceding 2 years. So if someone's been in the formal part of our capability process, that should be disclosed at that point. That can be a little bit of a complex area, so if you do get any questions and queries around that, please do give us a call and we can talk through to make sure that you're sharing information appropriately in those circumstances. And just to note there, if you're an academy, that provision doesn't apply, but you may still choose to ask questions about formal capability process. Another area where we're often asked questions is, what do we do if an individual resigns while there is a process ongoing? What can we share in the reference? So an individual perhaps is being investigated for a disciplinary issue and then they resign. What can we do? In a reference, you can factually share information about the point at which the process was at. So if the individual resigns during a disciplinary disciplinary process, it would be perfectly acceptable in the reference to reflect that and say there was an ongoing disciplinary investigation and the individual resigned during the course of this. Again, the key thing is to be factual in what you share, and we would always encourage you, should that come up, give us a call and we can talk you through the exact appropriate response in those circumstances. Okie doke. Shall we move on to look at what to do if concerns come about in a reference? So of course you'd obviously hope that everything was nice and straightforward and you got lovely glowing references from your applicants, but sadly on occasions that's not always the case. So what should you do if there's a negative response or negative information shared in a reference? I guess the first thing to do is probably just stop and ask yourself a couple of questions. So is the information shared, if it's negative, is it relevant? Does it have an impact on your thinking in terms of the suitability of the candidate? Does it make them unsuitable? Or is it information that's perhaps not relevant for the post, from something that arose a long time ago, that doesn't really change your decision making around that individual? And again, this goes back to what Summer was saying at the outset about referencing being used to support your recruitment process. So there might be some information that comes up in a reference which clearly is a deal breaker for you, and absolutely it makes it inappropriate and unsuitable for that individual to be offered a role. But sometimes you may have to make more of a judgment call, and then it's about thinking through, is this information relevant and does it make the applicant unsuitable? We'd always advise, if anything does come to light that's causing you concern, to explore those concerns that have come up in the reference with the individual and see what their response is, see what they have to say about that, because they might put a context around that which will change your thinking in terms of how significant that information is to the appointment process. You may also want to go back to the author of the reference to seek some further information or clarify if anything is unclear. If there are any concerns raised, you may just want to go back and do some fact-checking with the author just to understand a little bit more what the issues were. I guess we'd always say Treat any subjective opinions with caution. Going back to what we were saying on the earlier slide about references needing to be factual and objective, when you're looking through a reference, just do a bit of a sense check. Is this all factual? Is there very heavily weighted opinion in there which may suggest personality issues, a relationship issue in the workplace, which has really coloured the author's view of what they're sharing in the reference? It's just something to have on your radar. But again, if those subjective opinions do cause you sufficient concern, that may in itself be reason not to go forward with the appointment process. And remember that if you don't get satisfactory information from the references you initially approach, you could go back and seek further references, but only with the candidate's, the applicant's consent. Okay.
So in terms of dealing with those concerns, some really good tips there about how to review references, things to think about if concerns present themselves. Let's have a look at references and conditional offers then, because as we've already mentioned, references are part of those pre-employment checks, and any offer is conditional, should be conditional on satisfactory pre-employment checks. And certainly part of that, and the reason that we've brought this webinar to you today is because part of that is offers should be conditional on the basis of 2 satisfactory references. If the references aren't received or they're unsatisfactory, then absolutely you have the opportunity to withdraw the offer of employment. In terms of what's satisfactory, that's very much about your expectations, your standards for what is satisfactory in terms of references, in terms of pre-employment checks more generally. You do need to make sure that you're consistent in your approach and how you apply that to staff and staffing and your recruitment process over time. You need to ensure that you're consistent. It's more risky to terminate employment, withdraw an offer if employment has already started, and certainly if that's the case, then again, make contact with us and we can explore the issues, look at the areas of risk and help you make an assessment on what's the best course of action for you. I guess what this does do though is highlight, in terms of that element of risk, highlight the importance of having those satisfactory pre-employment checks back before the individual starts. I know there are recruitment pressures, but I suppose that does help to underline not only the value of having the pre-employment checks in place as part of the process in itself, but equally then the importance of having received those checks back before the individual starts in post. But if you do have queries, questions or issues in that regard, then as ever get in contact with us and we'll do our best to support you in whatever way is appropriate to help you move things forward. Let's just have a quick look at disclosing information to candidates then.
Yes, this is another area where we quite often get queries from schools, and it can be a bit of a minefield and a little bit difficult to know how to manage this. We would always suggest it's best practice when someone is writing a reference for the author to discuss the content with the individual, working on the basis that it's always better there's no surprises. So you may want to have an informal discussion with the individual and just say, I've received this reference, they've asked me this, this and this, I'm going to respond X, Y and Z. So in that way you're sharing information even before it's gone to the prospective new employer. There's no legal obligation beyond that for the author to share the reference, which is strange really, but that's how the law works. So there's no legal obligation for the author to share the reference, but an individual, a candidate, may make what's called a subject access request to the recipient of the reference to release the content. So the school that's actually received the reference may receive a request from the individual to share the content of that. Generally, the expectation is that the recipient will release that content unless there are exceptional circumstances. And the Information Commissioner's Office has actually put together a little bit of guidance around in what circumstances an individual may be permitted not to share a reference, and they really are quite few and far between. So circumstances where you may decline to share a reference is where a document couldn't be photocopied or edited in order to conceal the identity of the author, or it might be obvious to the individual who provided the reference, or where the author hasn't consented to the reference being disclosed. So as you can see, those circumstances are relatively limited. What we would probably advise is that if you do receive a subject access request from an individual candidate, as the appointing school, you make contact with the author of the reference to seek their consent to release either the reference in full, or a summary of the content, or the anonymised content of the reference. So that would be our advice. I think should you have any particular issues or concerns about that, again, it's something we would be happy to talk through with you, because it can be quite a problematic area. Just to point out there that if information is shared in a reference which is misleading or inaccurate, the candidate could claim damages. So clearly it goes back to what we were saying about having that duty of care, and also a duty of care to release information appropriately as and when it's requested. So I think my kind of learning point from that would be the importance of just chatting that through with us, should you be in a position where a candidate requests to see their reference.
Yeah. So with references, there is a lot to think about, a lot to explore, and in that vein we've got a little true or false quiz for you, and a series of questions to help in thinking about some of the issues that we've mentioned, and a couple of other issues besides, and help you think about how you would handle these issues within your school. I'm just going to fire up our quiz machine, ergo click a button, but just wait. Oh, if you could bear with me for a moment while I do that, and then we'll have a look at the quiz questions. It's going to come up on your screen. You'll have the opportunity to answer our questions. There's maybe 8 or 10 questions there, and then we can collectively come back together and we'll talk through the results, your results as a group, and we'll pick up on any particular questions that have caused concern. So without further ado, I'm going to click on our quiz, and here you go. We'll see you in a moment.
I feel like we need quiz music, Summer. We should have had some quiz music.
I would sing, but nobody wants that. Okay, 9% of you have submitted. Well done. Off the block, early doors. Keep going, folks.
Maybe the countdown clock.
That's it. A few more of you have completed. Well done. Okay, last couple of folks, I think, finishing off, and then we'll come back together. Okay. Liz mentioned it, so blame her, but I am going to do the countdown clock. So for the last couple of people, if you can make your way to the end of the test, because diddle-a-doo. It's the little things that keep us happy here, folks. Okay, I'm going to opt to close the test. We've had a good sort of 3 minutes on that, and let's have a look at the results. So let's see how we did. Let's have a look at the results. Oh. Let's review. That's what I wanted to do. Let's see what we came up with, folks. Okay, so question 1 then. Employers have a legal obligation to provide a reference for a current or former employee. All of you got that right. It's false, absolutely. As Liz mentioned, there's no legal obligation. It's general practice in your children's workforce, but there's no legal obligation. So great to see that you got that one right. Same again for question 2. You were all right there, spotted that as a red herring. And as we've talked about, you're looking to secure references or part 1 certainly of references prior to interview, and as Liz mentioned, you may well dovetail that with a secondary reference exploring health and absence issues. Verbal references should not be accepted. That is indeed true, and we've talked about that, so that's great. Oh, you are doing well. Look at these scores. Question 4, it's not necessary to request a reference where a candidate is known to the school. False. I'm so glad you put false, and certainly that would be a nod in the direction of keeping children safe in education and the expectations there. References can be provided by family and friends. False, on the basis that you are wanting to secure, wherever possible, professional employment references. We talked about personal and character references, and even with those references, personal and character, you'd be hopefully wanting to secure professional character references. Yes. So in the example that I shared about a student, it would be far better to have a reference from their tutor or from somebody where that they undertook a placement with, if that was part of their studies, than a wholly personal reference from a friend or family member. So well done there. Questions about absence, ill health should not be asked where references are requested prior to a job offer being made. Most of you got that right in terms of that's true, so well done. This next one, let's just have a look there. Question 7, hopefully you'll recall. Questions can be asked about all child protection safeguarding allegations which may have been made against a candidate. As noted under the safeguarding slide, the topic that we looked at there, that's actually false. You're only able to ask about, and you will only be given information about substantiated concerns. So it's important that you're aware of that. Question 8, we had questions can only be asked about current disciplinary warnings, not those that may have expired. Well done you, that's absolutely true, and all of you got that right, which is brilliant. Question 9, we had open references provided by the candidate should not be accepted, and again 100% of you got that right, so that's great going, certainly in terms of safer recruitment practice. And our last question there on our test stroke quiz, it is not necessary to obtain a reference from the candidate's current or most recent employer, and I'm pleased to report that all of you said false to that one. Absolutely, that's what you would be looking to do, so well done you. And hopefully useful in terms of just bringing together the discussions that we've had this afternoon, and certainly reassuring for us to see you interacting in that way, and certainly that clearly the topic of discussion has hit home for you. Let's just finish off on some top tips, as we tend to do with these sessions, and just revisit some key thoughts for the day.
So in terms of providing references, a few top tips to leave you with. Keep it factual. So any information you provide in a reference should be factually based, not opinion based. Only answer the questions that you're asked, and of course that's easier if you're responding to a pro forma style reference request and you're just answering the questions that you have been asked by the prospective employer. As we've said, make sure the reference you provide are in writing only. Verbal references, as we've discussed and for the reasons we've discussed, aren't advisory really. Ensure that you only provide the appropriate information about health, life sanctions and safeguarding, and that you're not sharing information, for example, about expired warnings, about health prior to job offer, or inappropriate safeguarding information. And remember, you can always give us a call to chat through those areas if you've got any concerns. And always have in mind that the employee could see the reference at a later date, so don't put anything in the reference that you wouldn't be happy and prepared to discuss with the candidate in person, face to face.
That's really good advice. We've got just a couple more top tips for you.
Yeah, and then on the other side, in terms of requesting references, again, a few top tips to leave you with. So as we've said, always request the reference before the job offer is made for very important safer recruitment purposes in schools or practices to request before the point of job offer. Only request a reference in writing, and wherever possible use that standard pro forma that we've discussed, and certainly go back to the website and check out our example template. You may find that useful. If you do have any concerns in the information you've received in a reference, take the time to clarify and explore those concerns and really understand what the author's trying to tell you in terms of concerns they have about the applicant. Always make sure that any offer you make, whether it be verbal or in writing, is conditional on the receipt of satisfactory references, and that gives you a get-out clause should you have issues when you receive references and the candidate not be suitable. So always make sure that that condition is around any offer. And again, be mindful that you might be required to share the information in the reference you've received with the candidate should they ask for it. And there are our top tips to bring the session to a close.
Absolutely, on this sunny Wednesday afternoon. Don't go just yet though, folks, because just want to tell you about a couple of things. So, and finally, future webinars. So next month, July, end of year rather, approaching, we'll be looking at developing your HR and training plan for 2017-18, and actually, all being well, next month's webinar is going to be particularly exciting because Liz and I have been working on a HR health check tool for you as schools. It'll be a freely available online tool, a diagnostic, so that you can assess your HR practice from policy through to recruitment, capability, approach to appraisal, sickness, absence and ill health, which we've touched upon in terms of references today. You'll be able to look at discipline and grievance, flexible working and special leave provisions, a really interactive tool for you to be able to assess your HR practice within your schools, with the ability to be able to receive live recommendations for things that you might want to look at going forward, to improve operations within your schools and support, as ever, your drive for school improvement. So that's really quite exciting. So we hope that you'll join us for that. You'll see there that September will again be looking at key changes for teachers' pay terms and conditions, as we will do every year, because that's the key month for that. And just on that note, we have on our website released the topics for the first part of next year, so terms 1 and 2. So get yourself on our website and you'll be able to register from September through to December and the various topics that we've got scheduled for you. Some details about some future events there, and similarly we've made our training plan for terms 1 and 2 of next year available to you, so have a look, and if there's sessions there that are of interest, then book yourselves in and come and join us. And thank you for joining us today. We hope you found it useful, and we look forward to speaking with you again. Take care.
Thank you everyone. Bye.